The cell was cold that winter night, the kind of cold that crept into your bones and stayed there. He wasn't always a prisoner. Once he was just a man who made mistakes, the kind that never let you go. One night, as rain poured outside the prison walls, a guard brought in 3 children. Dirty, trembling, eyes full of hunger and fear. They weren't supposed to be there, but the warden didn't know what else to do. The man took off his blanket and wrapped it around the smallest one. He split his food 3 ways. He taught them to read with scraps of paper and a broken pencil stub. For the first time in years, he felt human again. But time moved fast behind bars. The kids grew up. They were taken away. And he was left behind to count the years, waiting for the day his number came up. 25 years later, the prison was silent again. He sat in the chair, hands bound, eyes calm. The warden asked, "Any last words?" Before he could answer, the door burst open. A young man in uniform stepped in, voice trembling, but strong. "Stop the execution," he said. "That man is the reason I'm alive. Stay with me until the end, because what happened in that room redefined what redemption truly means." Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. Marcus Thompson wasn't born to be behind bars. He grew up in Detroit, middle class, decent grades, played baseball on weekends. His mother worked double shifts at the hospital. His father fixed cars and came home with grease under his fingernails and stories that made Marcus laugh until his sides hurt. But life has a way of taking sharp turns when you least expect them. Marcus was 22 when everything fell apart. His father died in a car accident on a Tuesday morning in October. His mother couldn't handle the bills alone. The garage his father owned started bleeding money, and the creditors came knocking like vultures circling a fresh kill. Marcus made choices. Bad ones. Desperate ones. He started small, stealing from convenience stores, grabbing cash from gas station registers. But desperation is a hungry beast, and it's never satisfied with scraps. The bank robbery wasn't supposed to happen the way it did. Marcus walked in with a note and a fake gun, thinking he'd walk out with enough money to save his mother's house. Instead, he walked out with blood on his hands and sirens wailing in the distance. The security guard had a heart attack, died right there on the marble floor while Marcus stood frozen, watching a life slip away because of his choices. 25 to life. That's what the judge handed down on a gray morning in November. Marcus was 23 years old, and the rest of his life stretched ahead of him like a concrete tunnel with no light at the end. Riverside Correctional Facility sat like a gray monument to human failure in the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania. The walls were thick enough to swallow screams, and the bars were painted institutional green, the color of giving up hope. Marcus learned quickly that survival meant keeping your head down, your mouth shut, and your expectations buried 6 feet under. His cell was 8 by 10 feet of poured concrete and broken dreams. He had a cot that felt like sleeping on cardboard, a metal toilet that barely worked, and a tiny window that showed nothing but razor wire and empty sky. For the first 2 years, he counted every brick in those walls, all 436 of them. The days blended together like watercolors in the rain. Wake up at 5:30. Count. Breakfast that tasted like cardboard. Work detail in the laundry or the kitchen. Lunch. More work. Dinner. Lockdown. Sleep. Repeat. The calendar on his wall became his enemy. Each X marking another day stolen from a life he'd never get back. But winter changes everything, even in places where hope goes to die. December 15th, 2003. The snow was coming down in sheets, and the heating system in Block C had given up the ghost 3 days earlier. Marcus was reading a tattered paperback novel when he heard the commotion in the corridor. Voices raised, children crying, the heavy footsteps of guards trying to figure out what to do with an impossible situation. Through his cell door window, he saw them. 3 kids, maybe 6, 8, and 10 years old, huddled together like frightened animals. Their clothes were soaked through from the storm, their faces pale with cold and terror. The smallest one, a little girl with tangled brown hair, was shivering so hard her teeth chattered like castanets. The story came in fragments over the next few hours. Their parents had been killed in a car accident during the blizzard. No family to claim them. The foster system was overwhelmed, and the roads were impassable. The local sheriff, an old friend of Warden Hayes, had brought them to the prison because it was the only warm building with space and security for miles around. It was supposed to be temporary, just until the storm passed and arrangements could be made. But temporary has a way of stretching when bureaucracy meets bad weather and worse luck. Marcus watched through his window as the guards tried to figure out where to put 3 scared children in a facility designed for hardened criminals. The administrative building was being renovated. The infirmary was full with a flu outbreak. The only space available was a converted storage room in the basement, cold and dark and completely unsuitable for children. That's when Warden Hayes made a decision that would change everything. He looked at Marcus through the cell door window and saw something the other inmates didn't have: remorse. Genuine, bone-deep regret that hadn't hardened into bitterness or rage. "Thompson," the warden said, his voice carrying the weight of a man making an impossible choice, "you were a first-time offender. No violence in your record here. These kids need somewhere safe and warm to sleep tonight." Marcus stared at the 3 small faces peering around the guard's legs. The little girl's eyes reminded him of his sister at that age, wide and trusting and completely dependent on the adults around her to keep her safe. "What are you asking me, Warden?" "I'm asking if you'll share your cell, just for tonight. Maybe a few days until we can make proper arrangements." The other inmates thought Marcus had lost his mind when he said yes. Sharing space in prison was like painting a target on your back. It showed weakness. It made you vulnerable. But when that cell door opened and 3 terrified children stepped inside, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 years of concrete walls and barbed wire. He felt needed. The little girl, whose name was Sarah, couldn't stop shivering. Marcus took his only blanket, the thin institutional gray thing that barely kept him warm on good nights, and wrapped it around her tiny shoulders. Her brother Jake, 8 years old with serious eyes and a protective streak wider than his small frame, positioned himself between Sarah and Marcus like a human shield. The oldest, Tommy, 10 years old and carrying the weight of being the man of the family now, just stared at Marcus with a mixture of suspicion and desperate hope. "You hungry?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. Prison food wasn't much, but it was more than these kids had seen in days. He split his dinner 3 ways, gave them his milk, watched them eat like they hadn't seen food in a week, which, he learned later, wasn't far from the truth. That first night, Sarah cried herself to sleep, clutching a torn piece of fabric that used to be her mother's scarf. Jake curled up next to her, one protective arm thrown her back across. Tommy sat awake in the corner, watching Marcus like a hawk guarding its nest. "It's okay," Marcus whispered into the darkness. "You're safe here. I promise." It was the first promise he'd made in 2 years that he actually intended to keep. The next morning brought more snow and the realization that the roads weren't going to clear anytime soon. What was supposed to be 1 night stretched into 3. 3 became a week. A week became something that nobody wanted to put a name to, because naming it would mean admitting that the system had failed these children so completely that their best option was a prison cell with a convicted felon. But Marcus didn't see himself as a felon anymore when he looked into their faces. He saw what he could have been if life had dealt him different cards. He saw responsibility, purpose, a chance to do something right in a world where he'd done so much wrong. The days developed a rhythm. Marcus would wake up early, before the children stirred, and use those quiet moments to plan. How to stretch his commissary money to buy them snacks. How to trade his rec time for extra blankets. How to shield them from the harsh realities of prison life, while still keeping them safe. He started teaching them things, math problems scratched into the concrete with a nail, reading lessons using the few books in the prison library, history lessons about places they might visit someday when this nightmare was over. Sarah, the youngest, took to learning like a flower turning toward sunlight. She would curl up next to Marcus during the long afternoon lockdowns, sounding out words in his worn copy of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Her favorite part was when Aslan came back from the dead, and she would make Marcus read that chapter over and over, as if repetition could make miracles real. Jake was the artist. He drew pictures on scraps of paper with stubby pencils, sketching memories of the life they'd lost and dreams of the life they hoped to find. His drawings covered the cell walls, stick figure families holding hands, houses with crooked chimneys and flowers in the yard, dogs that looked more like clouds with legs but somehow captured the essence of joy better than any photograph. Tommy was the thinker. He asked questions that cut straight to the heart of things. Why do bad things happen to good people? Where do you go when you die? What makes someone a criminal? And what makes someone a hero? Marcus found himself staying up late, long after the other two had fallen asleep, trying to answer questions that philosophers had been wrestling with for centuries. The weeks turned into months, and something extraordinary began happening within those concrete walls. Word spread through the prison like wildfire. The hardest men in Riverside, guys who hadn't spoken to their own children in years, started bringing Marcus things. An extra apple from lunch, a magazine with pictures of animals, a deck of cards with only 47 pieces left, but enough to teach 3 kids how to play Go Fish. Big Mike, a lifer who'd killed a man in a bar fight 20 years earlier, spent 3 hours carving a wooden horse from a piece of scrap lumber he'd smuggled from the workshop. His massive hands, scarred from decades of violence, worked with the delicate precision of a master craftsman as he shaped something beautiful for Sarah's birthday. Even Razor Rodriguez, whose reputation for brutality kept grown men awake at night, found himself slipping comic books through the food slot when the guards weren't looking. He never said a word, never made eye contact, but every few days another colorful story would appear, featuring heroes who always won and villains who always got what they deserved. The children didn't understand the significance of these gestures. They couldn't know that grown men who'd forgotten how to feel anything but anger were remembering what it meant to protect innocence. They just knew that people cared about them, that even in this dark place, kindness existed. Marcus watched his fellow inmates transform before his eyes. Men who, cursed like sailors, learned to watch their language. Conversations that usually centered around violence and revenge shifted to discussions about homework and bedtime stories. The entire cell block became quieter during the children's nap times, as if 200 hardened criminals had collectively decided that disturbing sleeping children was a line they wouldn't cross. But prison bureaucracy moves like molasses in winter, and the temporary arrangement stretched on. Weeks became months. The children adapted with the resilience that only kids possess. They learned which guards were friendly and which ones to avoid. They figured out the meal schedule and the count times. They made friends with the kitchen staff, who snuck them extra cookies, and the librarian who saved them the newest picture books. Tommy started helping Marcus with his correspondence courses. The boy had a mind like a steel trap, remembering every math formula and historical date Marcus taught him. He would sit cross-legged on the narrow cot, pencil stub in his small fist, working through algebra problems that challenged high school students. Jake turned the cell into an art gallery. His drawings evolved from simple stick figures to detailed portraits of the men who'd shown them kindness. He drew Big Mike's gentle smile as he taught Sarah how to braid friendship bracelets. He captured Razor's tough exterior softened by concentration as he read comic books aloud, doing different voices for each character. Sarah became the heart of their makeshift family. Her laugh could cut through the bleakest day like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. She had a way of crawling into Marcus's lap during the evening hours, her small head fitting perfectly under his chin as he read to her. Her favorite stories were always about families finding each other, about lost children discovering they were never really alone. The outside world kept trying to intrude. Social workers came and went, filling out forms and making assessments. Foster families were interviewed and background checks were run. But somehow, every potential placement fell through. Either the families weren't suitable, or the paperwork got lost, or budget cuts eliminated programs. It was as if the universe itself was conspiring to keep these children exactly where they were. Marcus knew it couldn't last forever. He knew that someday, someone would decide that 3 children living in a maximum security prison wasn't appropriate, no matter how much love surrounded them. He tried to prepare them for that inevitable separation. But how do you explain goodbye to kids who'd already lost everything once? The answer came on a Tuesday in April, 18 months after that first snowy night. A new social worker arrived, younger and more determined than the others. She took one look at the situation and declared it unacceptable. Arrangements were made. Foster families were found. The children would be separated, placed in different homes across 3 different states. The night before they left, the entire cell block threw a goodbye party. It was the strangest celebration in the history of American corrections. Men who hadn't cried since childhood openly wept as they hugged 3 small children who'd taught them how to be human again. Big Mike presented Sarah with the wooden horse he'd been perfecting for months. The detail was extraordinary. Every muscle and mane carefully carved, the eyes gentle and kind. "You ride this to anywhere you want to go, little princess," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Razor gave Jake a notebook filled with blank pages and a set of colored pencils he'd somehow acquired. "You keep drawing, kid. You got a gift? And gifts ain't supposed to be wasted." Tommy received something even more precious. Marcus handed him a thick manila envelope containing copies of every lesson they'd worked on together, every math problem solved, every essay written. "You're going to college someday," Marcus said firmly. "This is just the beginning of your education, not the end." The hardest part was watching them pack their few belongings into paper bags. 3 small lives reduced to scattered drawings, worn clothing, and treasured gifts from men the world had written off as irredeemable. Sarah clutched her wooden horse. Jake carefully rolled his drawings. Tommy shouldered his envelope of lessons like a soldier carrying important dispatches. As they walked down the corridor for the last time, every cell door window held a face. Hardened criminals who'd terrified communities were crying like children themselves. Hands reached through bars to touch small shoulders, to ruffle hair, to whisper final words of encouragement and love. At the main gate, the social worker waited with her clipboard and her impatience. She didn't understand why the goodbye was taking so long, why these children seemed so reluctant to leave a place that should have been their nightmare. Marcus knelt down to their eye level one final time. "Listen to me," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. "You 3 are going to do amazing things. You're going to help people and make the world better. And no matter where you go or how old you get, remember that you are loved. Remember that you matter. Remember that sometimes the best families are the ones you choose, not the ones you're born into." Sarah threw her arms around his neck, her tears hot against his cheek. Jake hugged his waist fiercely, as if he could somehow anchor them all to this moment. Tommy, trying to be the man of the family, shook Marcus's hand solemnly before breaking down and joining the group hug, and then they were gone. The van pulled away, carrying 3 children toward uncertain futures, leaving behind a prison full of men who discovered their capacity for love in the most unlikely place imaginable. Marcus returned to his cell alone for the first time in 18 months. The drawings were still on the walls. The wooden blocks Tommy had carved into learning tools still sat on the small shelf. Sarah's favorite blanket, the one she'd outgrown but couldn't bear to throw away, lay folded at the foot of the cot. The silence was deafening. For months his world had been filled with laughter and questions and the gentle chaos of children learning and growing. Now there was only the familiar prison quiet, broken occasionally by distant conversations and the eternal sound of metal doors slamming shut. But something had changed in Marcus during those 18 months. The bitter anger that had sustained him through his early years of incarceration was gone, replaced by something he'd thought he'd lost forever: purpose, hope, the unshakable belief that even the worst mistakes didn't have to define the rest of a person's life. He started writing letters, long, careful letters to 3 children scattered across the country, filled with encouragement and questions about their new lives. He wrote to Tommy about advanced mathematics and college applications. He wrote to Jake about art techniques and famous painters. He wrote to Sarah about everything and nothing, the kind of rambling, loving letters that fathers send to daughters away at camp. Some letters came back. Others disappeared into the vast bureaucracy of the foster care system. But Marcus kept writing, kept hoping, kept believing that somehow his words would find their way to the children who'd saved his soul. Years passed. Marcus earned his GED, then a bachelor's degree through correspondence courses. He started teaching literacy classes to other inmates, using the same patient methods he'd developed with 3 scared children. He became a mediator in prison disputes, helping men find peaceful solutions to conflicts that might otherwise explode into violence. The parole board reviewed his case multiple times. His record was spotless. His rehabilitation was obvious. But the victim's family opposed his release, and the political climate made early release for violent offenders nearly impossible. Marcus accepted each denial with grace, knowing that his real sentence wasn't about time served. It was about becoming the man those 3 children had believed he could be. 25 years is a long time to carry hope in a place designed to crush it. Marcus had stopped counting birthdays somewhere around year 15. The parole hearings blended together like gray paint on concrete walls. Each rejection felt like another nail in a coffin he was building himself. One disappointment at hope has a funny way of surviving in the A-time, but darkest places. It lives in letters that arrive years late, forwarded through 7 different addresses. It breathes in newspaper clippings that fellow inmates slip under your door, articles about local college graduates or young teachers making a difference. It whispers in the quiet moments before dawn when you wonder if 3 children you once knew still remember your name. Marcus had become something of a legend in Riverside, not the kind of legend built on violence or fear, but the quiet kind that grows from consistency. For 2 decades, he'd mediated conflicts, taught reading, and helped younger inmates write letters to families they'd abandoned. The guards respected him. The warden trusted him. Even the hardest cases sought his advice when their worlds fell apart. But legends don't save you from the calendar. And Marcus's calendar had run out. The appeal was his last shot. 27 years after that bank robbery, after a security guard's fatal heart attack, after countless nights wondering what his life might have been. His new lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Chen, had found procedural errors in his original trial, evidence that had been mishandled, witness testimony that didn't quite add up. It wasn't much. But it was something. Hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in November. 27 years, almost to the day since his sentencing. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus as he sat in the defendant's chair, hands folded, watching lawyers argue over technicalities that would determine whether he lived or died. His case had attracted attention. Not the circus atmosphere of high-profile trials, but enough media interest to fill the courtroom gallery. Reporters scribbled notes. Victim advocacy groups held signs demanding justice. A small cluster of prison reform activists countered with their own placards calling for mercy. But Marcus only had eyes for 3 empty seats in the front row. Patricia had tried to locate them, the children who'd shared his cell all those years ago. Tommy, Jake, and Sarah, now adults with lives and families of their own. The private investigator had found traces, addresses that led to other addresses, phone numbers that were no longer in service. "We found some leads," Patricia had told him during their last meeting. But tracking people who went through the foster system is like following smoke. They change names, move frequently, sometimes prefer to stay hidden. Marcus understood. He'd never expected them to come. Why would they? He was a chapter from their childhood they'd probably prefer to forget. A prison cell wasn't exactly the foundation most people wanted for their origin story. The judge was thorough. He reviewed every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every procedural misstep Patricia had uncovered. The original prosecutor, now retired and gray-haired, defended his decades-old work with the passion of a man protecting his legacy. The victim's family sat stone-faced, their pain as fresh as it had been 27 years ago. Hours passed. Legal arguments flowed like water over stone, wearing down resistance one precedent at a time. Marcus found himself thinking about those 18 months when his cell had been filled with laughter. Sarah's voice reading picture books aloud. Jake's drawings taped to every available surface. Tommy's serious questions about right and wrong. Questions that had no easy answers. He'd failed them in some ways. Failed to prepare them for how cruel the world could be to children without advocates. Failed to shield them from the harsh realities that followed their departure from Riverside. But maybe, just maybe, he'd given them something stronger. The knowledge that even broken people could love fiercely. That redemption wasn't about erasing mistakes, but about choosing to be better despite them. The judge called for a recess. The courtroom emptied like a theater after a disappointing play. Marcus remained seated, hands still folded, lost in memories that felt more real than the proceedings around him. "Marcus Thompson?" He turned toward the voice. A woman stood at the gallery rail, maybe 40 years old, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore scrubs, the comfortable shoes of someone who spent long days on her feet, and carried herself with the quiet confidence of a person who'd survived difficult things. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, standing slowly. "Do I know you?" She smiled, and something in that expression triggered a memory so powerful it nearly knocked him backward. A little girl with tangled brown hair, shivering in an oversized blanket, sounding out words from a worn paperback book. "My name is Sarah Matthews now," she said softly. "But you used to call me Princess when you read me bedtime stories." The courtroom tilted. Marcus gripped the back of his chair to steady himself, certain he was dreaming or dying or both. Sarah, little Sarah with her wooden horse and her favorite blanket, and her endless questions about why bad things happened to good people. "I work at Children's Hospital now," she continued, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "Pediatric nursing. I help scared kids feel safe when their world falls apart. I learned how to do that from watching you." Before Marcus could respond, another voice cut through the emotional haze. "You always said I should keep drawing." Jake stepped forward from behind Sarah, and Marcus almost didn't recognize him. The shy 8-year-old had grown into a tall man with paint-stained fingers and eyes that held both pain and joy in equal measure. He wore a faded denim jacket covered in small pins, the kind artists collect from galleries and coffee shops. "I teach art therapy now," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "Work with kids who've been through trauma, help them express what they can't say with words. Every technique I use, every breakthrough I witness, it all traces back to that cell where you taught me that broken things could still make something beautiful." Marcus felt his knees going weak. Two of them. Two of his children had found their way back to him. But where was... "You taught me that intelligence without compassion is just clever cruelty." The voice came from behind him, deep and authoritative. Marcus turned to see a man in a crisp military uniform, medals gleaming on his chest, posture straight as a rifle barrel, but the eyes gave him away. Serious eyes that had asked impossible questions in a concrete cell 25 years ago. "Colonel Thomas Carter," the man said, extending his hand with military precision. "United States Army Judge Advocate General's Corps. I prosecute war crimes and defend soldiers who've lost their way." Everything I know about justice, about the difference between punishment and rehabilitation, I learned from a convicted felon who gave up his blanket for 3 scared kids. The courtroom had gone silent. Reporters leaned forward, sensing a story that transcended legal proceedings. The victim's family stared in confusion. Even the judge had returned to his bench, drawn by the electricity in the air. Marcus looked at the 3 adults standing before him. Tommy, now Thomas, had become exactly what Marcus always knew he would be. A leader, a protector, someone who used his intelligence to make the world more just. Jake had channeled his artistic gifts into healing, helping others find beauty in their broken places. And Sarah, his precious Sarah, had transformed her own childhood trauma into a career spent comforting other frightened children. "You all came," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. "We never left," Sarah said simply. "Not really. Every child I comfort in the ER, every family I help through their worst day, you're there with me, teaching me that kindness isn't weakness, that love is the strongest force in the universe. Every kid I work with who thinks they're too damaged to create something beautiful," Jake added, "I tell them about a man who saw potential in 3 throwaway children, who taught us that our past doesn't have to define our future." Thomas stepped closer, his military bearing softening into something more vulnerable. "Every case I take, every soldier I defend or criminal I prosecute, I ask myself what you would do, how you would balance justice with mercy. You taught me that the law isn't about revenge. It's about protecting the innocent and rehabilitating the guilty." Patricia Chen had returned to the court with the prosecutor and the judge room along. They stood transfixed as 3 successful adults testified to the power of redemption in terms more compelling than any legal brief. "Your Honor," Thomas said, his voice carrying the authority of his rank and the passion of his conviction, "I stand before you as a colonel in the United States Army, as an officer sworn to uphold justice and defend the innocent. But more importantly, I stand before you as living proof that rehabilitation is possible, that mercy can coexist with accountability." He gestured to his siblings. "We 3 are not anomalies. We are not exceptions. We are the direct result of a broken man who chose to pour his life into others rather than wallow in his mistakes." Marcus Thompson didn't just serve his time. He transformed it into something that has rippled outward for decades. Sarah stepped forward, her nurse's training evident in how she assessed the emotional temperature of the room. "I've worked with hundreds of families facing impossible situations. I've seen what happens when children are abandoned by the system, forgotten by society, written off as lost causes. We were those children once, but won us that way. Man refused to see. He didn't just keep us alive during those 18 months, Jake said, his artist's eye cataloging every face in the courtroom. He taught us how to live, how to find hope in hopeless places, how to create beauty from chaos. Those lessons didn't end when we left that cell. They became the foundation of everything we built afterward." The victim's family looked confused, torn between their decades of justified anger and the undeniable evidence of transformation standing before them. The prosecutor shuffled his papers nervously, his clear-cut case suddenly complicated by the messy reality of human redemption. Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 27 years of incarceration. Not hope, which had sustained him through the dark years. Not peace, which he'd found in teaching and service, but completion. The circle that had begun with 3 scared children in a winter storm was finally closing. "I need to ask you something," he said to his grown children, his voice stronger now, "and I need you to be honest with me. Did keeping us together help you, or did it hurt you? Did those months in that cell give you strength, or did they damage you in ways I never realized?" The 3 adults exchanged glances, a silent communication that spoke to bonds forged in extraordinary circumstances. Sarah answered first. "It saved us, not just from the foster system or from being separated, but from believing we were worthless. You looked at 3 dirty, scared kids and saw potential. You invested in us when no one else would. It taught us that family isn't about blood or circumstances, Jake added. It's about choosing to love someone even when it costs you everything. You chose us every day for 18 months. That choice shaped how we see the world. Thomas nodded gravely. It showed us that redemption is real, that people can change, that mistakes don't have to be final judgments. Every person I've defended in military court, every case I've fought for rehabilitation over retribution, it all stems from watching you become the man you were meant to be. The judge leaned forward, his weathered face thoughtful. Mr. Thompson, in all my years on the bench, I've never seen anything quite like this. 3 character witnesses who literally owe their lives to the defendant. It's unprecedented. Your Honor, Patricia said, seizing the moment. This is exactly the kind of case the appeals court was talking about when they called for individualized justice. Yes, my client committed a serious crime 27 years ago. Yes, a man died, and that loss is irreversible. But the question before us isn't just about punishment. It's about the purpose of our justice system. She gestured toward Thomas, Sarah, and Jake. These 3 adults represent the ripple effects of rehabilitation. Colonel Carter has served his country with distinction, prosecuting war criminals and defending American soldiers. Ms. Matthews has dedicated her life to healing children in crisis. Mr. Henderson uses art to help trauma victims process their pain. How many lives have they touched? How many people are better off because Marcus Thompson chose redemption over bitterness? The prosecutor stood, his face flushed with frustration. Your Honor, this is all very moving, but it doesn't change the fact that Harold Morrison is dead, that his family has lived with that loss for 27 years. We can't let emotional appeals override the demands of justice. Mrs. Morrison, the victim's widow, rose slowly from her seat. She was in her 70s now, her hair white, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped her cane. The courtroom fell silent as she made her way to the front, her son reaching out to steady her. Judge Hamilton, she said, her voice thin but clear. I've listened to everything today. I've heard about rehabilitation and redemption and second chances. And I want you to know that Harold's death still hurts every single day. It will hurt until the day I die. Marcus closed his eyes, preparing for the condemnation he knew he deserved. Mrs. Morrison continued, and the word hung in the air like a bridge between judgment and mercy. I've also heard about 3 children who were saved, about hundreds of other children who've been helped, because those 3 grew up to be healers and protectors, about soldiers, criminals, rehabled, defended, annotated, and families comforted. She turned to look directly at Marcus, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I can't bring Harold back. Nothing can do that. But if his death somehow led to all this good, if it was the catalyst that put you in that cell to save those children who went on to save others, then maybe his death wasn't completely senseless. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scribbled frantically. The victim advocacy groups looked stunned. Even the prosecutor seemed at a loss for words. Mrs. Morrison held up her hand for silence. I'm not saying I forgive you, Mr. Thompson. I'm not sure I'm capable of that. But I'm saying I don't need your death to make Harold's life meaningful. It already was meaningful. And if letting you live means more children get saved, more families get healed, more broken people get the chance to become whole, then that's what Harold would want. She turned back to the judge. 27 years is enough, Your Honor. Let this man finish the work those children started. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as Mrs. Morrison returned to her seat, supported by her son who looked as shocked as everyone else. The moral authority of her forgiveness had shifted the entire atmosphere of the proceedings. Judge Hamilton removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, clearly grappling with a decision that would define the rest of his career. I'm going to call a recess, he said finally. I need time to consider everything I've heard today. As the courtroom cleared, Marcus found himself alone with Thomas, Sarah, and Jake for the first time in 25 years. They stood in an awkward circle, 3 successful adults and the convicted felon who had helped raise them. I'm sorry, Marcus said finally, for all of it, for not being able to prevent you from going into the system, for not being there when you needed me, for being the reason you ended up in that cell in the first place. Sarah reached out and took his hands, her touch gentle but firm. You have nothing to apologize for. You gave us 18 months of safety and love when the whole world had abandoned us. You taught us how to read and think and dream. You showed us that adults could be trusted, that love could exist even in the darkest places. You gave us each other, Jake added. Without you, we would have been separated immediately. We would have lost instead. We got to stay the only family we had left, together until we were strong enough to face the world alone. Thomas nodded. And you gave us a moral compass. Every major decision in my life, I've asked myself what you would do, how you would balance justice with mercy, strength with compassion. That guidance has never steered me wrong. They talked for another hour, filling in the gaps of 25 years. Sarah's nursing school struggles and her marriage to a fellow pediatric nurse, Jake's art exhibitions and his work with homeless veterans, Thomas's military service, his law degree, his recent promotion to colonel. Each story was a thread in a tapestry that had begun with a desperate choice on a snowy night. A convicted felon sharing his cell with 3 abandoned children. A decision that had seemed insane to everyone except the man making it. As the afternoon wore on, other visitors began arriving. Big Mike, now in his 70s and walking with a cane, had been released 5 years earlier and worked as a counselor for ex-offenders. Razor Rodriguez had died in prison, but his nephew brought a letter Razor had written before his death, expressing pride in what the children had become. Even some of the guards from those early days came by, retired now, but still remembering the strange months when Cell Block C had been transformed by the presence of 3 children and the man who'd chosen to protect them. When Judge Hamilton recalled the court to session, the gallery was packed beyond capacity. Word had spread through social media and news outlets. The story of redemption and forgiveness had touched something deep in the collective consciousness. This is one of the most difficult decisions I've ever had to make, the judge began. On one hand, we have a serious crime that resulted in death. The victim's family has suffered an irreparable loss, and society has a right to expect justice for such acts. Marcus felt his stomach drop. The formal tone suggested a denial was coming. On the other hand, Judge Hamilton continued, we have extraordinary evidence of rehabilitation, not just the defendant's personal transformation, but the demonstrable good that has flowed from that transformation. 3 lives saved and redirected toward service, countless others helped through their work. A legacy of healing that continues to grow. He paused, looking directly at Marcus. Mr. Thompson, you committed a terrible crime 27 years ago. Your actions led to a man's death and devastated his family. No amount of good works can undo that harm or fully balance those scales. The courtroom held its breath. However, the purpose of our justice system is not merely punishment. It is also protection of society and, where possible, rehabilitation of offenders. In your case, the evidence suggests that continued incarceration serves no purpose beyond retribution. You pose no threat to society. You have demonstrated genuine remorse and complete transformation. Most importantly, your release would allow you to continue the work of rehabilitation and healing that has already borne such remarkable fruit. Marcus felt the world spinning around him. Therefore, I am granting your appeal. Your sentence is commuted to time served. You are free to go. The gavel fell like thunder, and the courtroom exploded into chaos. Thomas, Sarah, and Jake rushed forward, enveloping Marcus in embraces that felt like coming home after a lifetime of exile. Reporters shouted questions. Camera flashes popped like lightning. Through it all, Marcus held his children, the broken man, and the lives he'd helped heal. Mrs. Morrison's words echoed through the courthouse steps as reporters swarmed around Marcus and his 3 children. The November air was crisp, carrying the promise of winter. But for the first time in 27 years, Marcus breathed it as a free man. The transition felt surreal. One moment he was inmate 47291, property of the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. The next, he was Marcus Thompson, citizen, standing on public sidewalks with nowhere he had to be and no guards watching his every move. Sarah stayed close to his side as they navigated the media circus. Her nursing instincts kicked in, recognizing the signs of overwhelming sensory input in someone who'd been institutionalized for nearly 3 decades. The questions came like machine gun fire. How did it feel to be free? What were his plans? Did he think justice had been served? Thomas handled the press with military precision, his training evident in how he controlled the narrative. Mr. Thompson will not be taking questions today. This has been an emotional and exhausting process for everyone involved. We ask for privacy as our family adjusts to this new reality. Jake hung back, his artist's eye cataloging the chaos, probably already imagining how he'd capture this moment on canvas. The swirl of cameras and microphones, the mix of celebration and controversy on different faces, the way freedom looked when it came wrapped in complexity rather than simple triumph. They escaped to Sarah's car, a practical Honda Civic that smelled like hand sanitizer and coffee. Marcus found himself in the passenger seat, staring out at a world that had changed dramatically since 1996. The buildings looked different, sleeker somehow. The cars were foreign to him, all curved edges and digital displays. Even the people dressed differently, everyone staring at small rectangular devices in their hands. "It's going to be overwhelming," Sarah said gently, navigating through traffic with the calm efficiency of someone accustomed to crisis situations. "The world moved pretty fast while you were inside. Don't feel like you have to catch up all at once." They drove to a small diner on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that looked frozen in time. Red vinyl booths, checkered linoleum floors, a waitress with kind eyes and sensible shoes who didn't seem to recognize the man whose face had been on the evening news. Marcus ordered coffee and scrambled eggs, simple foods that tasted like freedom. His hands shook slightly as he held the ceramic mug, muscle memory from decades of plastic cups and metal trays, making this simple pleasure feel revolutionary. "Tell me about your lives," he said, his voice still adjusting to conversations without time limits or guards listening in. "Really tell me. I want to know everything I missed." They talked for hours as the diner emptied and filled again with the dinner crowd. Sarah described her path through nursing school, the nights she'd worked double shifts to pay tuition while carrying a full course load. She'd specialized in pediatric emergency medicine, drawn to helping children in crisis by memories of her own childhood trauma and the man who'd helped her through it. "I keep your picture in my locker," she admitted, pulling out her phone to show him a faded photograph from their prison days. 3 children and a man sitting on a narrow cot, reading together. "When the job gets hard, when I'm dealing with a scared kid whose world just fell apart, I remember how you made us feel safe when safety didn't exist." Jake talked about his art, how it had evolved from those early prison sketches into something more sophisticated. He'd had gallery shows in Philadelphia and New York, his trauma-informed art therapy work gaining recognition in academic circles. His paintings explored themes of redemption, found family, and the beauty that could emerge from broken places. "I've been working on a series," he said, sketching absently on a napkin as he spoke. "Prison pieces, not the violence or the despair that everyone expects, but the humanity that survives in impossible places. The way men who society wrote off could become protectors when children needed them." Thomas, now Colonel Carter, had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. He'd prosecuted war criminals and defended soldiers who'd made terrible mistakes under impossible circumstances. His understanding of justice had been shaped by watching Marcus transform from bitter criminal to devoted caregiver. "Every case I handle, I think about proportionality," he explained, "about the difference between accountability and vengeance. You taught me that people aren't defined by their worst moments, that redemption is possible even in the darkest places." He'd married another JAG officer, a woman named Maria who specialized in military family law. They had 2 children, ages 8 and 10, who'd grown up hearing stories about their grandfather Marcus, the man who'd saved their father's life before their father was old enough to understand what salvation meant. "They want to meet you," Thomas said. "Maria, too. We've been waiting for this day for years, hoping it would come, but never quite believing it would." As evening approached, they faced the practical reality of Marcus's situation. He had no home, no job, no identification beyond his prison-issued release papers. His social security number existed in a bureaucratic limbo. He had no credit history, no recent work experience, no references from anyone who wasn't either incarcerated or employed by the correction system. "You're staying with us," Sarah said firmly. "I've got a spare bedroom. It's small, but it's clean and quiet, and nobody's going to lock night." The U-Inn drive to Sarah's house took them through neighborhoods that hadn't existed when Marcus went to prison. Suburban developments with names like Whispering Pines and Heritage Valley, filled with young families pushing strollers and walking dogs. Normal life, the kind Marcus had forgotten existed. Sarah's home was a modest 2-story colonial with a white picket fence and flower boxes under the windows. It looked like something from a magazine about the American dream, complete with a tire swing hanging from an old oak tree in the backyard. "This is beautiful," Marcus said, standing in her living room and taking in the family photographs on the mantelpiece. Sarah at nursing school graduation. Sarah in scrubs, holding a newborn baby. Sarah with a man in medical scrubs who had kind eyes and laugh lines. "That's David," she said, following his gaze. "My husband. He's working tonight, but he'll be home tomorrow. He's a pediatric surgeon. We met during my clinical rotations." The house felt warm in ways that went beyond temperature. Books scattered on coffee tables, children's artwork stuck to the refrigerator with magnets. A cat that appeared from nowhere to investigate the stranger, decided he was acceptable, and promptly fell asleep on his feet. That first night of freedom, Marcus lay in a real bed with clean sheets and a window that looked out onto a peaceful street. No bars, no concrete walls. No sounds of men crying or arguing or slowly losing their minds. Just silence broken occasionally by the distant hum of late-night traffic or the settling sounds of a house at rest. He couldn't sleep. 27 years of institutional routine had conditioned his body to expect lights out at 9:30 and wake up at 5:30. His internal clock was permanently set to prison time, and freedom felt like jet lag from traveling to another planet. Around 2 in the morning, he gave up on sleep and padded downstairs to the kitchen. Sarah was already there, sitting at the table with a cup of tea and a medical journal spread out before her. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, looking up with a gentle smile. "It's too quiet," Marcus admitted. 27 years of sleeping in a room with 200 other men. You get used to the noise. This silence feels loud, if that makes sense. Sarah nodded. "I had the same problem when I first moved out of foster care. Too much space, too many choices, too much freedom. It takes time to adjust." They sat together in comfortable silence. 2 people who understood what it meant to rebuild a life from nothing. Sarah had done it at 18, aging out of the foster system with a high school diploma and determination. Marcus was doing it at 55, with even fewer resources, but with the advantage of having 3 grown children who refused to let him face the world alone. "I've been thinking about what I want to do," Marcus said finally, "with whatever time I have left." "You've got decades ahead of you," Sarah protested. "You're not that old. Old enough to know that time is precious. Old enough to want it to count for something." He wrapped his hands around the warm mug she'd given him, marveling at the simple pleasure of choosing his own beverage. "I want to work with kids. Kids like we were. Kids the system gives up on." Sarah's eyes lit up. "There are programs, mentorship organizations, juvenile justice initiatives, residential facilities for at-risk youth. Your story, your experience, it could help kids who think they're beyond saving. Would they let someone like me work with children? With my record? We'll figure it out." Thomas knows lawyers who specialize in expungement and record sealing. There are paths forward, especially with character witnesses like the three of us. The next few weeks passed in a blur of bureaucratic necessities. Getting a state ID required multiple trips to the DMV and a stack of paperwork that would have challenged a law student. Opening a bank account meant explaining a 27-year gap in financial history to suspicious tellers. Applying for jobs required creativity in describing work experience that consisted entirely of prison industries and volunteer programs. But Marcus wasn't alone in navigating this maze. Thomas used his military connections to help with federal paperwork. Jake introduced him to nonprofit organizations that specialized in reintegration services. Sarah provided not just housing, but emotional support during moments when the outside world felt overwhelming. The media attention was intense but brief. Marcus's story had all the elements of viral content: redemption, forgiveness, the power of love to transform lives. Cable news shows wanted interviews. Publishers offered book deals. Hollywood producers called about movie rights. Marcus turned them all down. He wasn't interested in capitalizing on his story or becoming a symbol for prison reform movements. He wanted to disappear into quiet service, to spend whatever years remained making amends through action rather than words. His first job came through an unexpected source. Father Miguel Santos, the chaplain at Riverside Correctional, had followed Marcus's case through the appeals process. When he learned about Marcus's release, he reached out with an opportunity. "I run a program for at-risk youth," Father Santos explained over lunch at a small Mexican restaurant near the church. "Kids who are headed for juvenile detention or worse. Most of them have given up on adults, on authority figures, on the idea that anyone cares whether they live or die." The program was called Second Chances, and it operated out of a converted warehouse in one of the city's roughest neighborhoods. 30 kids between the ages of 12 and 17, all of them carrying more trauma than most adults could handle. Some were aging out of foster care like Thomas, Sarah, and Jake had. Others were running from abusive homes or living on the streets. "I need someone who can reach them," Father Santos continued. "Someone who understands what it feels like to be written off by society. Someone who knows that rock bottom isn't the end of the story." The work was harder than anything Marcus had done in prison. These weren't just children in need of basic care and education. These were kids who'd been betrayed by every adult in their lives, who'd learned that trust was weakness and vulnerability was dangerous. Marcus started small. He showed up every day, consistent and reliable. He listened without judgment when they told their stories. He shared his own story carefully, focusing not on the crime that had sent him to prison, but on the 18 months when 3 children had taught him what love looked like. Slowly, connections began to form. Maria, a 15-year-old who'd been trafficked by her own mother, started staying after group sessions to help Marcus clean up. She reminded him of Sarah at that age, fierce and protective but desperate for safety. Devon, a 13-year-old who'd witnessed his father kill his mother, had Jake's artistic temperament, but channeled it into anger rather than creation. Marcus sat with him during his explosive outbursts, offering presence without trying to fix what couldn't be easily repaired. Carlos, 16 and already with 2 arrests for assault, had Thomas's intelligence and leadership potential, but was using those gifts to organize other kids into criminal activities. He tested Marcus constantly, looking for the breaking point where this new adult would give up on him like all the others. The breakthrough came 4 months into Marcus's work at Second Chances. Carlos had been caught stealing from the program's petty cash fund, money intended for field trips and special activities. The board wanted him expelled, his juvenile officer was recommending detention, and even Father Santos was running out of patience. Marcus asked for a private meeting with Carlos in the small office he'd been given. It wasn't much, just a desk, 2 chairs, and a window that looked out onto a courtyard where kids played basketball during free time. "Why?" Marcus asked simply. "You don't need the money," You're smart enough to steal without getting caught if you really wanted to. So why? Carlos slouched in his chair, all teenage defiance and practiced indifference. Why do you care? You gonna send me back to juvie like everyone else? I'm not sending you anywhere. I'm asking you a question. They sat in silence for long minutes. Outside, younger kids laughed and shouted as they played. Normal childhood sounds that neither Marcus nor Carlos had experienced at the appropriate age. You want to know why? Carlos finally said, his voice thick with unshed tears. Because everyone leaves. Everyone gives up. And I'm tired of pretending to care about people who are just going to abandon me anyway, the pain behind. Marcus recognized was the same defense, the anger. Mechanism that had turned him bitter during his early years in prison. The same wall that Thomas had built to protect himself from further disappointment. You're right, Marcus said quietly. Most adults in your life have failed you. Most people you've trusted have let you down. And I can't promise I'll never disappoint you or make mistakes. Carlos looked up, surprised by the honesty. But I can promise I'm not going anywhere. Not because you're perfect, not because you never mess up, but because that's what family does. Family stays. You're not my family, Carlos shot back. You don't even know me. Family isn't just about blood, Marcus replied, echoing words he'd spoken to 3 scared children in a prison cell decades earlier. Sometimes it's about choosing to love someone even when they make it hard, even when they test you, even when they steal from you to see if you'll give up on them. That evening, Carlos returned the money. Not all of it, and not immediately, but gradually over the following weeks. More importantly, he started participating in group activities instead of disrupting them. He began mentoring younger kids instead of leading them into trouble. Word of Marcus's success at Second Chances spread through the juvenile justice system. Social workers started referring their most difficult cases. Judges began ordering community service at the program instead of detention. Other organizations reached out, wanting to replicate the model, but Marcus remained focused on the individual children rather than the growing program. Each kid who walked through those doors carried their own unique combination of trauma and resilience. Each one needed something different, whether it was structure or freedom, challenge or comfort, tough love or gentle guidance. The work was exhausting in ways that prison had never been. In prison, Marcus had been responsible only for himself, and occasionally for mediating conflicts between other inmates. Here, he carried the weight of dozens of young lives, each one balanced on the edge between hope and despair. Some nights he went home to Sarah's house and collapsed on the couch, emotionally drained from spending 8 hours trying to reach kids who'd been taught by experience not to trust anyone. Other nights he lay awake worrying about specific children, wondering if he'd said the right thing or made the right call in a difficult situation. But there were victories too, small ones that felt enormous in context. Maria graduated from high school and enrolled in community college with plans to become a social worker. Devon's artwork evolved from violent imagery to beautiful portraits of the other kids in the program. Carlos became Marcus's unofficial assistant, helping newer children adjust to the program and navigate their trauma. A year after his release, Marcus was invited to speak at a conference on criminal justice reform. He'd turned down dozens of similar requests, but this one was different. The audience would be primarily composed of formerly incarcerated individuals who were working in re-entry services, people who understood the challenges of rebuilding a life after prison. Standing at the podium, looking out at faces that reflected his own journey, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility. These weren't politicians or activists or academics studying the prison system from the outside. These were people who'd lived it, survived it, and chosen to dedicate their freedom to helping others do the same. I'm not here to talk about policy or statistics, he began, his voice steady despite his nervousness. I'm here to talk about possibility, about the truth that our worst moments don't have to define our final chapters. He told them about 3 children who'd taught him what love looked like in the darkest place imaginable, about how 18 months of shared humanity had sustained him through decades of incarceration. About the day when one of those children, now a grown man in military uniform, had walked into a courtroom and demanded that the system see Marcus as more than just his crime. The work we do now, helping kids who've been written off by society, it's not charity, he continued. It's not even justice. It's love in action. It's proof that broken people can create beautiful things when someone believes in their potential for transformation. The audience was silent, but it was the kind of silence that comes from recognition rather than disinterest. These were people who understood that redemption wasn't a single moment, but a daily choice to be better than your past. After his talk, Marcus was approached by dozens of conference attendees, former gang members who now ran violence intervention programs, ex-addicts who counseled people struggling with substance abuse, women who'd been trafficked and now worked to rescue others from that life. Sometimes redemption doesn't look like what we expect. It doesn't come with fanfare or perfect endings. It comes in the quiet moments when a broken man chooses love over bitterness, when 3 scared children grow into adults who heal others, when a victim's widow finds meaning in mercy rather than revenge. Marcus Thompson's story reminds us that our darkest chapters don't have to be our final ones, that broken people can create beautiful things, that love, real love, doesn't just transform the person receiving it, it transforms the person giving it too. Today, Marcus continues working with at-risk youth, and Thomas, Sarah, and Jake carry forward the lessons they learned in that prison cell. Their story proves that sometimes the most unlikely families create the strongest bonds, and that redemption is possible even in the places where hope goes to die.